Today we're going to be discussing the process of photosynthesis, which is the collection of sunlight by pigments in plants and the conversion of sunlight energy into the chemical energy stored in sugars. Plants have pigments. We all know that. In fact, you might know the specific pigment that appears green called chlorophyll. What you might not know is there are two different types of chlorophyll. There are chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Both chlorophylls appear green. Both chlorophylls absorb in the purples, indigos, and blues, the oranges and the reds, and reflect yellows and greens. That's why we see the yellow and green color. So what does it mean that they absorb in those different light colors? Well, the different light colors have different energies, so that means that they're absorbing those different energies. The thing is that plants often have accessory pigments. Accessory pigments are pigments of other colors. If you look below in the diagram, you'll see that there's a carotenoid, for instance. And carotenoids we see as orange because they reflect orange but absorb the other colors of the spectrum. Now, we oftentimes don't see these colors, but sometimes in the fall when plants pull the chlorophyll out of their leaves, we see the accessory pigments that were there all along. They were just hidden by the chlorophyll. So why are leaves green? Leaves are green because their main pigment is chlorophyll and they reflect green and yellow light. If I was to look closely at a plant leaf, I would see that there were tiny pores underneath it. Those are called stomates. Those allow gases to enter and leave the plant. And then on the top, I'd see that there's a waxy cuticle. But I'd also notice that there's tons of cells inside the leaves that are filled with these green dots. Those green dots, on closer inspection, I would recognize as chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are the organelles that are responsible for photosynthesis. If I was to look inside of the chloroplast, I would see that the chloroplast itself is also filled with tiny green dots. And in between those dots, there was a clear fluid. The dots are actually stacks of what I call green pancakes, also known as thylakoids. Thylakoids are like tiny solar-powered generators. They generate ATP and another high-energy electron carrier or another high-energy molecule called NADPH. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But what you need to know is that the thylakoids are the part of the chloroplast that actually have the pigments. They have these little pigment collections called photosystems because they absorb photons of light energy. So the photosystems are the parts that make the thylakoids green, make the chloroplast green, and make the plants green. Now the stacks of pancakes are called granum, grana for plural, and the grana are these stacks of solar-powered generators. The fluid in between is called the stroma. The stroma is like cell cytoplasm in that it's not just a clear water fluid, it's like a soup of proteins and enzymes and nutrients. All sorts of stuff happens inside the stroma. Way back in the day, we used to say that there were light reactions and dark reactions. That's actually a little bit of a misnomer or a misnaming of the reactions. So now that we say that the reactions are light dependent and light independent. Well, what does that mean? Well, I told you that some reactions happen in the thylakoids, and those are the ones that take sunlight to make cell energy. Those are the light reactions. They depend on sunlight directly. In the stroma, those high energy molecules are used to run the machines that actually make the sugar. So the reactions that happen in the stroma are called the light independent reactions because although they indirectly depend on sunlight, they don't directly depend on sunlight. So light dependent reactions take sunlight and turn it into cell energy, and light-independent reactions take the cell energy molecules and actually make the sugars. The light-dependent reactions happen in the thylakoid. The reactant is water. The product is O2. The energy that goes in is sunlight, and the energy that goes out is ATP and a high-energy electron carrier called NADPH. When electrons are moved from one location in the cell to another, they need chaperones. So a positively charged NADP plus comes together with an hydrogen ion or an H plus, and they chaperone the high energy excited electrons to a different part of the cell, so those high energy electrons can be used to make the bonds in the sugar molecule. If those electrons were just released, they would actually damage the cell, because as we know that, for instance, when electrons move through a wire, that's electricity, and if you let that electricity loose, you get shocked. So we need to make sure that those high energy electrons are moved very carefully from one part of the cell to another part of the cell so the cell doesn't get damaged. High energy electron carriers, like NADPH, are necessary to chaperone electrons from one part of the cell to another. In the light-independent reactions, sugars are produced using the high energy molecules that are made during the light-dependent reactions. So the thylakoid captures the sunlight and turns it into ATP and NADPH. Whereas in the light-independent reactions, the CO2 is collected and turned into sugar by using the energy ATP and NADPH. We're going to go over the light-dependent reactions in just a little bit more detail, but first we have to talk about the photosystems. The photosystems are very important because they actually are what capture the sunlight in order to make the high-energy molecules. The photosystems are found embedded in the thylakoid membrane. Remember, the thylakoids were those stacks of green pancakes inside the chloroplast. So the photosystems are embedded in all of those stacks of pancakes. So there are a lot of the photosystems throughout one single chloroplast. The photosystems are made of a whole bunch of different types of pigments, and what happens is that when the sunlight hits the photosystems, the pigments start to vibrate. When the photosystems suck up electrons, and we'll talk about how they get those electrons later, but when they suck up the electrons and they start to vibrate, they make the electrons vibrate. When the electrons start to vibrate, that's when they're in their excited state. That's when they can do the most work. That's when they have the most power. So the photosystems use the sunlight to vibrate, and then they transfer that vibration to the electrons. This allows them to then harness the energy inside the excited electrons to do some really cool things. When water enters the thylakoid, it's actually ripped apart in this process called photolysis. And in photolysis, the oxygen is taken off of the hydrogen molecules, and two oxygens come together in order to make an O2, which just squiggles its way straight through the cell membrane and back out of the plant. That's how plants breathe out oxygen. But what happens to the hydrogens? Well, if you remember, hydrogens are just a proton and an electron. And so what happens is those hydrogens are left behind. But then their electrons are ripped off and shunted into the photosystems. In this case, photosystem 2, which strangely enough is the first photosystem that we're going to talk about. So the electrons are taken off the hydrogen atoms and pushed into photosystem 2. Then photosystem 2 excites the electrons and pushes it into what we call the ETC, the electron transport chain. The ETC is a collection of proteins, and other molecules that transfer the electron down a pathway. Every single time that electron is transferred, it gives off a little bit of energy to its carrier molecule. A lot of those carrier molecules are proton pumps, a type of protein pump that goes against the concentration gradient. So it's pumping from low concentration outside the thylakoid to a high concentration inside the thylakoid. So those hydrogen ions, or those H pluses, start to build up and build up and build up inside the thylakoid, creating a force inside the thylakoid, so that when the gate opens with ATP synthase, they shoot out really fast and they can turn the crank inside the ATP synthase, which allows the ATP synthase to suck in ADP and make ATP. Remember, ATP is the high energy form of that molecule. So let's repeat. The electrons are sucked into photosystem 2. They excite the electrons. As they go down the slide, the electron transport chain, the energy from those excited electrons is used to pump protons into the thylakoid. That builds up a force that allows ATP synthase to make ATP molecules. So in a roundabout sort of way, photosystem 2 makes ATP. At the end of the electron transport chain, the electrons no longer have an excited energy state. You could say that they're sad electrons. But that's okay, because that's where photosystem 1 will pick them up and re-excite them. So photosystem 1 also collects sunlight energy, starts to vibrate, transfers those vibrations into the electrons, and then the electrons are now in a very excited state. So, how are we going to get those electrons to the other part of the chloroplast, into the stroma, without hurting the chloroplast? It has to have chaperones. That's when NADP plus and H plus come in from either side like bouncers and grab the excited electrons so that they can't do any damage as they chaperone them from the thylakoid to the part of the stroma where they can be dropped off to run the Calvin cycle. To summarize, in the light-dependent reactions, water comes in and oxygen leaves. The water leaves behind its hydrogen ions, which are also known as protons, that help build the proton force. The electrons that were taken off the hydrogen ions are sucked up by photosystem 2 and excited. As they go down the electron transport chain, they pump extra protons into the thylakoid space, building up an intense proton pressure. The proton pressure is then used to make ATP using the enzyme ATP synthase. So photosystem 2 makes ATP in a roundabout sort of way. At the bottom of the electron transport chain, when the electrons are no longer excited, they get picked up by photosystem 1. Photosystem 1 uses the sunlight to re-excite the electrons, and those excited electrons are picked up by their chaperones, NADP plus and H plus, turned into NADPH, which carries the electrons to the Calvin cycle so that those electrons can be used to make the bonds that turn CO2 into sugar. The light-independent reactions are where the sugars are actually produced. That's where CO2 comes in and is bonded to other CO2 molecules in a cycle pattern until eventually a 6-carbon glucose can be produced. However, it doesn't happen that quickly nor that easily. So what do you have to know about the Calvin cycle? Well, I want you to know that the Calvin cycle happens in the stroma, which means it's happening in the part of the chloroplast where there's no pigments. But that's because it doesn't use sunlight energy. It uses the energy molecules that you produced in the last set of reactions. It uses ATP, and the high energy electron carriers drop off their high energy electrons. So the NADPH also comes in. In this process, CO2 is sucked into the Calvin cycle using an enzyme called rubisco. It is attached to molecules within the cycle, and it's called a cycle because eventually, every single time it goes around, it's going to add one more CO2 molecule. Now, I know we're looking to make a 6-carbon sugar called glucose, but actually what comes out is a 3-carbon sugar called G3P. So, the Calvin cycle has to go around 3 times to make a G3P, because every single time it goes around the cycle, one CO2 is added. After it's made 2 G3Ps, the 2 3-carbon sugars can be added together to make one 6-carbon sugar, which is the glucose that we find so tasty. So what is the end result? Sunlight energy is turned into ATP and NADPH, high energy molecules. Those high energy molecules are used to run the factory that's in the stroma of the chloroplast that actually makes the sugars from CO2. Water comes in and actually donates the electrons that are needed to make those high energy molecules. So, in the light-dependent reactions, water comes in, donates its electrons and hydrogen ions, and O2 leaves. The electrons are excited to make ATP and then re-excited to make NADPH. Those high energy molecules are used to run the sugar factory called the Calvin cycle. Every turn of the Calvin cycle, one CO2 comes in. Eventually, after 3 spins of the cycle, a 3-carbon sugar is made. After 2 3-carbon sugars are made, they can be combined to make the 6-carbon sugar called glucose. I think at this point you need to write the balanced equation for photosynthesis. I bet from the heading of the slide you could probably figure out what can affect the rate of photosynthesis in a plant. Temperature, light, and the availability of water. The thing is that if temperature increases it's going to increase the rate of photosynthesis, just like any chemical reaction is increased. But if a plant gets too hot, what's going to happen? The plant's going to get damaged, right? Remember that enzymes, if they're heated too much, also become denatured. So that's not good. So the rate of photosynthesis can increase in these conditions, but then oftentimes it decreases or it reaches a stalemate. If a plant has extra light, it's going to increase in photosynthesis, increase in photosynthesis, and increase in photosynthesis until its sugar-making factories are at full efficiency. Once that happens, doesn't matter how much light you give the plant, it's not going to do any better. Water is really necessary for photosynthesis to occur. If a plant runs out of water, it can't take the electrons from the water, and so it can't do photosynthesis. That can be really tough in dry conditions. Different plants do better in different sets of conditions because either they have better pigments for those conditions or they use special strategies to be more efficient in those conditions. For instance, if I took a cactus and I put it in a shady, cool, moist area, it's not going to do very well. Or if I took a plant from the rainforest and I stuck it in the desert, it's also not going to do very well. So I want you to read the graph below and see if you can figure out this problem. In photosynthesis, 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O are used to make C6H12O6 plus 6 O2, which means that carbon dioxide and water in the presence of sunlight can be used to make glucose and oxygen. I want you to test yourself and make sure you know what happens in the 2 phases of photosynthesis, the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions. Test yourself and make sure that you know what part of the chemical reaction for photosynthesis happens in each. Have a great day.